Okay. So just like with Photoshop, I can start with a new file. I can also drag a file or open a file directly into Illustrator. But typically I'm going to start with a new file. It has some presets, so you can see some basics for different types of media, just like Photoshop does. It has the same different basics like mobile, web, print, film, art. So you can use one of those presets, or if you click New File, you can create your own. So Illustrator has a bunch of different units. Points is like for if you're working with like text and typography, if you're like laying out a magazine or something like that, that's what you would be using. We're not really doing that. We're making stuff for the computer, so I'm going to switch this over to pixels. This is like some weird, crazy, I don't know where this came from. I guess, oh, that's an A4 letterhead. So let's go over to web and choose something a little bit more regular. So I'll just use this minimum profile. And I'm making a self-portrait, so I'll switch it to portrait view, so I'll have a little bit more height than width. And I can look at the rest of this stuff. There's a few other options here. We don't really need to worry about bleed. We can stick with one artboard. Here's one thing that you might want to change is the raster effects. So this is sort of like the resolution of the image that you're working with. So with Illustrator, we're going to be working with vector graphics. So instead of working with pixels, like individual pixels with different colors, we're working with geometry that fills in color. And so we'll see what that looks like in a second. But when we export, this is where we'll actually see this, is these different resolutions. So 72 pixels per inch is kind of the default screen resolution. And that's based on like earlier devices, like earlier phones, earlier screens, stuff like that. That was how many pixels are actually in an inch of screen space, is 72 pixels in an inch. There's higher resolution, so if you're working with something that you're going to print, you want to do 300 pixels per inch. That's what, if you want to print like a really nice high resolution image, that's what the printer will actually do, is 300 different lines of color per inch of paper space. Okay, so that's what that means. And then there's stuff in the middle. You can convert, it's very easy to convert between these values when you're using vector art because it just sizes up. It's just geometry. It's not individual pixels. So what you choose here doesn't really matter all that much because you can easily convert between the different values, but that's just what that refers to. So since I'm not planning on printing this anywhere, I'm going to stick with the screen. But if I don't like the way that looks, I can always change it later. So I'm going to click Create. And so now I have my document. So this looks really similar, right? We have on our right side, we have some properties, we have layers. This actually looks like, let me reset this. Reset essentials. Okay, so I guess this is what the default looks like now. So I have my layers. Normally, I feel like when I usually open Illustrator, layers is like down here, like that. But we can leave it up here. We have properties. This libraries area we don't need to worry about for now. But we also have layers, just like we do in Photoshop. And then on the left side, we have our tools. So there's some similar tools, like we still have the paintbrush and the type tool. We have the eraser, gradient tool. We have a lot of similar stuff. But then we also have some different stuff, like the pen tool and the different selection tools. So that's what we're going to be talking about as we go over creating an illustration. So then we have our colors down here. We have our zoom tool, just like in Photoshop. I can zoom in and zoom out. I can hold space to move my canvas around, just like in Photoshop. So there's a lot of similarities, but what we're going to be drawing is a little bit different. So I'm going to save my document before I do anything else. I'm going to save it on my computer. And I'm going to click on the little arrow to get the bigger dialog box and go to MMP 100 self-portrait 3. Let's just call this self-portrait 3. And the default file for an Illustrator file is AI for Adobe Illustrator. So that's like our PSD file. This is going to save all of our information. We want to keep this, but when we want to export something, we're going to export a JPEG or a PNG just like we do in Photoshop. So I'm going to click Save, click OK, and now we can get started. So in Illustrator, we're working with geometry, as I mentioned, and we can either create shapes or draw with the brush or other tools, and then we're going to edit those geometries. So one thing that I like to use in Illustrator that I don't always necessarily use in Photoshop as much is grids and guidelines. So this exists in Photoshop too, but I tend to use it more when I'm working in Illustrator. And so there's a couple ways that I can see these. So if I go to View and I go down to Show Grid, it's going to show me this grid that goes over my whole canvas. So this isn't part of my image, but it's going to make it easier for me to see, you know, how big different parts of my drawing are. And I can turn this off easily by hitting Command and quotation mark to turn that on and off. And then we can also change the size of the grid. So if I zoom in over here, you're going to see that the grid actually gets cut off by my document. So it's not actually matching the size of my document. So I could either change the size of my document or I can change the size of my grid. Either way. Do you have a question? Is it on? Okay, so I can either change the grid to match my document or I can change my document to match the grid. So one thing that's different in Illustrator is if I want to change the document, I can't just go to change the canvas size. See, there's no option for that up here. What I can do is I can change the artboard. So I can go to Artboards, which is under Object, way down here somewhere. Oh, it won't let me get there right now. Okay, so Window, Artboards. Okay, let's put this down here. And so I can click on that artboard if I want to change the size. So maybe I'll change the size to 1024 to match the height. But now we can see my grid is still off a little bit if I zoom in over here. So we're still off a little bit. So let's take a look at the grid. So if I want to change the grid, I go to Illustrator Preferences, and then under Guides and Grid, it's going to let me change the size of the grid. So this says grid line every 72 pixels. So that matches my 72 pixels per inch, but it doesn't match my general setup. And so what I'm going to do actually is change this to 64, and that is going to match the width and the height that I have set up, because my width, let's open up my calculator real quick. So I'll probably talk about these measurements at some point in more depth, but just so you know what I'm doing. So 1024 divided by 64 gives me 16, so that's a nice round number. And my other dimension is 768 divided by 16, that's 48. So that gives me two round numbers. So if I change the grid line every 64 pixels, now my grid matches my document, so that's good. And then I can also change the number of subdivisions. So you can see there's like 8 columns and rows in each one of these grids. You might like that, or you might think that's too many. So you can go back, go to Preferences, Guides, and Grid, and I can change the subdivision. So if I say 4, now I have fewer rows and columns to work with. So that's the grid part. The other thing that I can add here is guides. And so to add a guide, I can turn on my ruler. So I did that by hitting Command R. I can also go to View and go to Rulers and Show Rulers. And so the ruler shows me, how many pixels there are in my document. And if I want to create a guide, I can drag down from the ruler and make a line on the page. So let's hide my grid for a second. So if I want to make guides to kind of change where I'm seeing my image, I can do that just by dragging these around and matching them to where they are on the ruler. If I want to be really accurate, I can also go to View and go to Guide, and it won't let me make a guide. Why won't it let me make a guide? Maybe I have to have something else selected. Okay. Let me see. I'll just Google that. Illustrator, make guide disabled. Okay, I have to have an object selected to make a guide. Okay, so we'll do that later. So let's bring our grid back, and I'm just going to make some guides. So I'm going to drag this down and put it on the first line of my grid here. I'm going to drag this over to the first line on this side. I'm going to drag one over to this side, to this first little column. It's not really lining up exactly where I want it. Let's see. Let's undo those. Okay, so that's why. So the other thing I can choose in the view section is I can choose snap to grid, and that's going to make things snap to the different positions on my grid. So I want to make sure that's on. I'm going to choose snap to grid. And so now when I drag a little guide down, see it's going directly to those different lines on my grid. So now I can make a guide that is exactly on my different grid lines. So then I'm going to go over here and drag a guide down here. And then the last one, I'm going to move all the way down and then drag a little guide right here. So now when I zoom out, I have these nice guides. So again, this isn't part of my image. This is just a way for me to set up my document so I can align things. Do you have a question?
I wanted to know
What we're on?
Yeah, like what?
What do you mean?
Like Photoshop or Illustrator.
It's Illustrator. Yeah. Any other questions? You guys able to make some guides?
What is 1024?
What?
Is the size? Is it 1024, 1024?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's good.
All right.
Yeah. So go to View and make sure you have guides. Yeah, and so it's already saying, okay, so it should be showing. So try dragging down from the ruler. Yeah. So click on the ruler and then hold and drag. There you go. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so sorry if that wasn't clear. To get the guide, you have to click on the ruler up here, and then you don't release yet. Hold the mouse button, keep it down, and then drag. You'll see that little dotted line, and then you can place the guide on the screen. Okay, other questions? Yeah. Go to View, go to Guides. So you can set up as many guides as you want, and you can also remove them if you want to delete them. And then you can toggle between. So one thing that you'll notice is, see how, like with my guide right now, it's still snapping to the grid, even though I can't see the grid. So if I turn the grid on, my guide is snapping around to the different parts of my grid. But even if I have the grid off, it's still doing that snapping. So if I want that to stop, I have to go back to view and turn off snap to grid. So if still can't make guides, I don't know what that's about, but if I want to get rid of my guides, I can click clear guides and that'll remove them. All right, so I like to set up my document a little bit before I get started. So now I'm going to add in some shapes. So with Illustrator, we're mainly working with different geometries, and it gives us a bunch of different shapes that we can work with, but we can also draw. So I'm going to start with some basic shapes. If I click on this rectangle, you can see the basic shapes that I can use. So I'll start with the rectangle. And since I have these guides, I just want to make like a little frame for my illustration. So if I have, I'm going to undo for a second. If I have guides and then, where is it? Doesn't have snap, maybe they don't. Snap to grid, pixel, point, glyph. Okay, whatever. So if I have my guide set up, you can see that when I'm intersecting with a guide, it shows me, it gives me like a little hint there. It says guide, intersect. And so that makes it easier for me to draw things that I know are, aligned with each other. So if I want to draw this square, I have those guides there, and it's going to let me draw the square. It makes it a lot easier. So now I have this square, but I can't really see anything, right? Because I don't have any color associated with the square. And so that's what I'm going to use my colors down here. You can see there's two. There's one that's like a filled in square. That's the fill. That's what the color on the inside of the square is going to be. And then you can see there's a square with a hole in the middle. That's the stroke. That's going to be the outline of my square. So if I double click on the big square and I choose a color, maybe do something like blue, now I have this filled in blue color. If I click on the stroke, oh, and it's bringing up my color. I don't know why. I feel like this should be up here. I'm going to check and see. I have Essentials. Let's try Essentials Classic. No, this isn't what I want. Let's go back to Essentials. Reset. Oh, okay. I guess that's what it gives me. Anyway, I can click on the stroke. And if I want like a black stroke, I can click OK. And then I can change the width of the stroke. So I can increase the stroke. Oops. And so now we see the square with the blue fill and the black stroke. And so I can make the stroke much larger if I want to. Like if I do like 100 pixels, it's going to be very thick. If I want it to be smaller, I can just choose something smaller. And then I can also change the opacity of the whole thing with that opacity slider. So those are kind of like the basics of any shape or drawing you're going to make. Any geometry you add into the illustration is going to have a fill and a stroke, but you don't have to have them. Like if I say I just want this to be a border, I can go to fill and then I can click on this red like slash, and so now it's just see-through. It doesn't have a fill. Okay, so let's pause for a second and then we'll go over the selection arrows. Is everybody good? Does anybody have questions? Yeah. What?
Canvas size.
So we don't have canvas size like in Photoshop. We have the artboard.
Oh.
So if you want to change that, you can go to Window and open up the Artboards window. I'm going to dock this down here. And then you can click on this little document here, and that'll give you the width and the height of the artboard. So that's one difference between Illustrator and Photoshop, is that we don't have like the canvas size, image size thing. We just have our artboard that we can change. All right, any other questions? Okay, so let's go over the selection tools. So I have these two different arrows. So there's the selection tool, and then there's the direct selection tool. And this is the trickiest part of learning Illustrator, is the difference between these and how to use them. The main difference, the selection tool, which I can also get by hitting V on the keyboard, if I click on something, it's going to move the whole thing, okay? With the direct selection tool, if I click on my shape, I'm going to move the whole thing if it's all selected. But if it's not selected, so if I hit, I think Command-Shift-A, yeah. So if I deselect everything, and then I click on one of these anchor points, it's only going to move that anchor point. It's not going to move everything. So that's kind of the tricky part, because I can select all of my anchor points. And now, oops, okay, let's select these. So now I can move both of those anchor points at the same time. If I select all of the anchor points, and then I use my direct selection, now I'm moving the whole shape, right? But the direct selection tool can either move just a point or whatever is selected. So that's kind of the trickiest part. A lot of mistakes that you'll make is like, if I move this over here, but then I go to direct selection tool, now it looks like it's still doing the regular selection tool, but that's because all of my points are still selected. So I can click outside of the shape to unselect, or I can hit Command A will select everything, or Command Shift A will deselect everything. And then I can grab one anchor point and move it, or I can drag to select two anchor points, and then I can move both of those anchor points at the same time. Or I can drag to select those, and then I can hold Shift, oops, and select another one, and now I'm moving three of the anchor points, but that last anchor point is staying in the same place. So that's kind of the trickiest part with Illustrator, is getting used to using those different selection tools. And basically, like, you'll try to do something and it won't do what you think it's supposed to do, and then you'll have to undo and go back. So that's kind of the trickier part. Okay, so let's make some more shapes, and then we'll look at the pen tool. So some other shapes that we have the ellipse tool. This just makes a circle. If I don't hold Shift, it can have a different width and height. If I hold Shift, it's going to have the same width and height. Okay, so if I make this circle, let's put it, I'll take the selection tool, move it up here. And let's say I want to put this, I'll make this like be the sun. I can choose like a yellow for the fill, get rid of the stroke. So now I've got like a little sun in my self-portrait scene. Some other shapes, the polygon tool. So this makes different polygons. And there should be, in my properties somewhere, I should be able to change, where's that? Should be able to change how many sides it has, but it's not showing up here. That's not what I want to do. Let's see, polygon. Okay, let's Google it. Illustrator polygon size. drag its side widget. I don't see. Oh, is it this one? There we go. Okay, it's this little square that's on its outline. Can change the number of sides. So if I go all the way down to 3, then it's a triangle. 4 is obviously a rectangle. I can go up to 11. So then I can change the size. If I hold shift, it'll be symmetrical. And I can rotate it, just like in Photoshop with my transforms. But I just have to select it. I don't have to do the Command T to transform. There's also these little points in the middle, these circles that can let me round the corners. So all of my shapes with corners have that. If I take my rectangle and I grab that, I can round the corners of my rectangle. And let's see, what should this be? Can use this as the head of our self-portrait. So let's choose a different color. Choose pink. Put this in here. Another shape that we have is just lines. So if you want to just draw lines, maybe I'll draw some mountains in the background. I can just draw a line like this. This obviously is not going to have a fill, but it has a stroke. So if I want to draw like a green little mountain, I can do that. And then it should let me draw another line. And I can connect my 2 lines. And I can select these. I can also group these or join these if I want to make one shape out of them. And I can do that with all of my shapes in Illustrator. So if I right-click on these 2 lines and I say join, now it's just going to create another shape that has all of these geometries. So if I select this with the selection tool, it's going to move the whole thing. And let's move the stroke up a little bit. And let's just see what happens if we add a fill, just for the heck of it. So if I add a fill, so it is going to fill in that area now that I have some geometry. It's not just a straight line. Since I have the 2 lines connected, I can add a fill there. And I'm looking for my color picker. Where is it? Oh, it's in the toolbar. So if I want to match one of these colors, I can go to the color picker and I can match that green. Okay, but for some reason it's not letting me. Selecting this color. I don't know where my color picker is. Let's see. I guess it gives me the option. It adds that color to my library. Anyway, let's put this down here for a second. So another thing that we can do in Illustrator, instead of using layers, so we do have layers, and the layers work the same way, but we also have the arrangement of shapes in our scene. So I want to demonstrate that real quick. So I have these 2 shapes, and you can see that my green sort of mountain shape is on top of my pink shape. And so if I want that to be different, I can go over to the layers here, and I can move these around. So in Illustrator layers, we actually have more information about what's in our layer because we have all these different objects. So we have the path, this is a polygon, we have the ellipse, then we have all our guides, which we can turn these all on and off inside the layer. But we can also arrange these on the page. So if I right click on my pink shape, okay, for some reason, so there we go. So if I right click on the pink shape and I go to arrange and I say bring to front or bring forward, it's going to move my shape on top of the other shape. So see, it moved it up over here. And I can also do that in here. I can drag these guys around up and down if I want them on top of each other or not. But I can also do it on the screen. If I'm just working here, I can right click and go to arrange, and I can say send backward. This is already in the back. I can say bring forward or bring to front, or I can say send back. So I can move my shapes up and down. So with my layers, I can do the same thing. I can lock this layer, and now I can't change any of this stuff. I can also turn it off if I don't want to see it. So if I want to use this as my background, and I want to keep working on the self-portrait but add other stuff in here, I can lock this so that I don't have to worry about selecting those other parts of my scene. All right, so let's finish. I'm going to add a couple points to my little mountain guy here. So once I have an object, I can actually change the object. So I don't have to stick with the original thing I created. I can move these points around, and I can also add points. So I'm going to move this over here, take this guy here. So I want to expand this a little bit. I'm going to move this point down here, line it up with that. I'm going to move this point over here. I'm going to move this point here. And so if I want to add points to this, what I can do is use the pen tool. And so you can see the pen tool does different things depending on whether you're hovering over just blank space or if you're looking at a point on one of your shapes. So if I'm in blank space, I'm just creating a new shape, and I can click wherever I want to add points. If I'm hovering over an area, see, this says it turns into like a little minus thing, and now I can add a new point to my shape. So I can finish my mountain range that I started with a little line. And I can add some points down here, and then if I go back to where it started, you'll see that it shows me that anchor, and it is going to connect those points at the end. So now I have this, like, I still have my pen tool, right? And I want to get rid of that. I can just hit escape, and now it's going to get rid of that. So now we can still change the individual points. So I'll go to the direct selection tool, so I can move these points around if I want to change my little mountain range. I can also add points. So if I go back to my pen tool, if you hover somewhere along the path, you can see the pen turns into a little plus. So if I add a path right there, and then I go back to my direct selection tool, now I have a new point in my thing. So I can add more geometry. I can also remove geometry. So I can go back to my pen tool, and if I hover over a point that's in my path, instead of a plus, it turns into a minus. So if I click on the minus, then it gets rid of that point. So I can make easy edits to my geometry. So in Illustrator, a lot of what you're going to be doing is using the pen tool to create some geometry, but then using the selection tool to update or move the geometry around. So one more thing we can do real quick. I'm going to zoom in on these corners. So I kind of created this section where my mountain is going beyond the side of my corner. So I want to be able to deal with this. So what I can do is use the anchor point tool. And what this does is if I drag out like this, it'll create a curve. So this is like a trickier part that we'll spend a little bit more time on. But when I have that curve, this is called a Bezier curve, where it has these little handles that I can move my curve around. I'm going to turn off the fill for a second so we can see this better. So once I create that curve, I get these handles where I can add to my curve, and I can still move my point. So I can move this point over here, and then I can kind of match the curve of my rectangle. I could also do a mask like I did in Photoshop with this, but if I just want to do it with geometry, I can create this little curve, and then this vector point over here is going to let me move that curve. And then with this one, I want this to be straight, so I can just straighten this out like this. So I can do the same thing over here. I'm going to need to add a point to give me some room, so I'm going to go back to my pen tool and add a little point here. And then I'm going to hit escape and add another little point there. So now I can add in a curve here. I'll go back to my anchor point tool, and oops, I'm hitting the guide. Let's lock my guides so I don't have to worry about that. And my path is all the way down here. Let's move this up. So now let's grab this. So if I drag out, I'm going to get that little curve, and I can bring my anchor up here and then try to match the curve, or I can move it down here and match the curve this way. I need another point. I thought I made points already. Let's go back and do that. So I'm hitting undo. So I need a couple points for this to work. So I'll go back to my pen tool. Okay, I need a point there. And I need a point down here. So then let's move this in. So now I have two different parts of my curve, and I can kind of match this up. And if I want to be a little more accurate, this is pretty inaccurate. Let's actually get rid of this middle point. So I'm going to go back to the pen tool, and oops, let's minus this one. So I'll get the pen tool. It's not letting me minus this one. Maybe if I hold Option. For some reason, okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit because I feel like I have it two anchors. Oh yeah, so the problem here is I'm on a different anchor tool, or on a different anchor. So let's get out of here. This is something that you'll run into a lot in Illustrator, is these points should be joined. So let's grab these 2 points and say join. Okay, now we have one shape. But I moved my whole mountain, so I'll go back to the selection tool and move this back here. Okay, now I should be able to edit this more easily. So now, oh, it's still not giving me, okay, I'm just gonna delete this anchor here. There we go. Okay, so let's just join these two. Now I have like another anchor point somewhere. Oh yeah, I have this. Let's see. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so now let's join these guys. And then I can go back to my conversion tool and match this a little bit better. Okay. There we go. So let's put our frame back on top, zoom back out, and add our fill back in. Okay. Okay. So let's pause for a second and make sure everybody's good. Let me know if you have any questions.